Greyford, the year of our Lord 1321, a low market town pressed between a marsh and the sea road, owed its knight to Fat, the lord of the 100. Hugh, who kept a stone house and a black seal, had affixed a new proclamation to the post by St. Bride's Well. It spoke in clerkly Latin, then in an English scraped thin, by order of his lordship, and for the safety of the town, all tallow to be rendered, weighed, and stamped, all candles to bear the red bead of duty, all rushes to be taxed in bundles, all light accounted, lest fire or rebellion rise out of the dark. That morning had the smell of boiled marrow and wet wool. Greyford's lanes were still greasy from night rain. From behind the butcher's shambles the smoke of a dozen tallow coppers rose white and heavy. Dogs nosed after offal. Flies went mad on the skins. A bell in the Augustinian house tolled prime, and left a thin iron taste in the air. Beneath it all, the constant stink of the tannery, oak bark and urine, breathing from the river bend like an old animal. They called her Mara of the Dips. Her husband had gone with a winter cough 2 years past, and she had kept their trade, rushlights for the poor, farthing dips for feast days, if a family could muster coins, a few squat tallow candles for alehouses and stalls. She boiled fat in a shallow copper, cooled it in a tub, and with the steadiness of devotion she dipped her cords, up and down, 100 times until the wick grew a skin of pale grease, and then a body of light. Shed was narrow and black with soot. The walls hung with strings of drying wicks and slabs of congealed pale tallow. The floor was rush-strewn against the ooze. Fleas gleamed in the straw like clever seeds. The proclamation changed the sound of the town by noon. Knights of ink, 2 clerks with tallies, the bailiff's man with a rope of iron seals, and a chandler from the guild in the port city up the road had come under the Lord's protection to measure and mark. They set a table by the market cross, a block of oak scarred by generations of fines, and the bailiff's man hammered a crimson wax bead to the post to show the power behind their hands. The bead bled a little down the wood. It looked like a clot stopped mid-drip. "Bring your fat," the bailiff's man called. "Bring your dips. Bring your rush bundles. By ounce and by dozen. Those without mark shall be seized." The sun strained through a wet pall and could not dry the cobbles. Fishwives, butchers, 2 other Chandler widows, and Maras neighbor Tom the thatcher, who bought rushes by the bale, formed a queue like a penitent line. Each carried weight that could be turned into light. Sweat in damp cloths, skins of grease, limp bundles of marsh rush cut and peeled. Mara watched the stamp go down on the first pound of fat. The clerk wrote a figure on his rotating tally stick and murmured it to his partner. The guild chandler from the city held the iron die against the tallow and tapping a little crown and a crude bucket into the soft meat of grease. Then he took his fee, a clipped penny, half for the lord, half for the farmer of the tax, the man from the city who had paid for the right to collect it. He had small, careful hands. He smiled at the money as if at a child. "By God's nail, look there," a fishwife muttered when her turn came. "They mark the fat itself. They mark your light before it's born," Mara said, and the words came out harsher than she meant. She tasted smoke. Behind them a boy sang the bread prices to the assize. An alderman, stout from his own table, weighed loaves and fined a baker whose crust rang wrong. The baker was sent to the pillory with a chalked sign. His wife wept flowery tears and caught them in her shawl. When Mara's turn came, the clerks weighed her sweat sack, 2.5 pounds, and 15 rush bundles beside. She watched the crown and bucket stamp sink into fat. She could smell the faint meat-sweet scent that would cling to the finished candles no matter how many times she washed the cord with ash lye. The guild chandler leaned near to sniff her rushes. "Wet," he said with satisfaction. "They burn too quick. Tax them as dear for the city's men and the Lord." "They are wet because the marsh is wet," Mara said. "Do you command the water too?" "I command charge," he said, smiling again with those careful hands, and took another halfpenny. All afternoon, the table worked. Twice the bell tolled, as if the sound could stamp time, as easily as the iron die stamped tallow. At none, a boy in the stocks sneezed softly. He had stolen a capon. Now he wore a rope of rush cords around his neck. The rope was decorative and humiliating, the kind of gesture that taught a lesson without blood. A woman with a lice comb stood in the shelter of St. Bride's and pulled it through her daughter's hair with slow patience, revealing a clustering of tiny white eggs that looked like soft sand. She picked them off and dropped them into a bowl. The market stank of everything people needed: oil, cheese, hides, onions, salt, fish guts, and, newly invested with the weight of law, fat. By the third day, Mara knew the rhythm of the tax. Boil early, before the inspectors came to count, so the first ladle of grease could be poured off into a jar that would never see an iron stamp. Out of that cup might come 4 rushlights, 6 if she cut the wick shorter. She hated herself for the theft even as she did it, because to sell unstamped light was to become criminal. But the boy with the stocks had gone home with ringed ankles and a mouth like gray paper, and the sign the alderman held up when he pricked a loaf low on weight came back to her in a dream. Short, short, short. Everywhere the weight of things was being clipped. The Lord's men formed a night watch to enforce the new order. For safety, they said, and the word tasted of iron locks. They walked at curfew with billhooks and a coil of weak chain. At the 4th toll of St. Bride's bell, the mellow hour when the gutters began to glisten and cook fires dim to coals, the watchman went house to house along the thatched rows and listened for whispering flames. Stamps visible, they called in the half-light. Red bead on your candles. 6 wick lengths only in alehouses. No open flames near eaves. Mara learned to keep the jar for her hidden rush oil buried beneath the ash in her hearth. Rushlights were mean, unstable things. One gust and the flame would gutter and gnaw the wick in a new place. Their smoke had a bitter tang you would find on your tongue if you licked your teeth before bed. On a Thursday with the meat cart flies quieted by a breeze, the guild chandler himself came to Mara's shed to assist the stamping, this at a halfpenny fee besides the tax, for guild knowledge. He wore a leather apron new enough that it still creaked. He picked up one of Mara's farthing dips, pinched its side, and sniffed. His careful hands pinched all things. "You have poured well," he said. "But your wick is coarse hemp. It draws too greedily. The poor will complain they burn too fast." "They will complain with empty hands," she said. "They will set cow dung in a dish to glow. They will sing by memory. And they will hand you their pennies to complain better." He laughed softly. "Do not be sour, mistress. You are lucky to be licensed. There are women in the marsh hamlets who are not. They will be stripped of their pots." He wrote the word licensed in his little book and made her sign with a cross. He held up the die and showed her the crown, the bucket, and a third mark at the bottom, an absurd little bell. "This," he said, "is the mark of the watch. He who burns without this mark steals from the peace. He who steals the peace steals the king. Do you understand?" "I understand," Mara said. Her hands smelled of ash and old suet. Under her nails, the lie had listened to her blood and bitten. She watched him stamp, stamp, stamp. Each tap wrote a new law on the surface of something that was once the inside of a beast. That evening, after complying, but before the sky was properly dark, a narrow fire bit the thatch over a brewer's yard. It came and went like a fox, one moment a hungry breath, the next snuffed by a bucket line. People blamed a rushlight. The watch cried that it was an unmarked candle, and paraded a man through the lanes with a cord of damp rushes wound about his waist like a penitent's rope. No proof was offered, but proof had ceased to matter the moment the seal melted into town like rain into a road. If you burned unstamped light, you were the tinder for the fear everyone had been holding. There were two punishments for smoke theft, which was what they called it when they wanted to make the invisible solid. The first, the stocks for a day with a string of scorched rushes tied to the wrists. Children would come and wag their fingers under your nose and sing that you had eaten light that was not yours. The second, a fine so deep it would settle in the cart tracks of your life and fill with water every rain. The inspectors grew bolder. They walked into the dark like cats. They pressed their small iron die to butter to see if it would take. They turned up floor rushes with a boot and sniffed them for the scent of oil. They held up candles to the window to see if light came through too easily, that telltale of over-thin tallow cheating the flame of the fat's expected pace. In the alley behind the dyer's shop, they found a boy who smuggled 6 unstamped candles under his shirt, and though they did not beat him, they took the candles and left him with the warmth from their theft cooling off his chest like the last heat from a loaf. The third Sunday after the proclamation, the priest of St. Bride's preached a sermon whose heart was a lock. He spoke of order as a hedge against wolves. He spoke of God's candle, the sun, and of the small humble candles made from beasts that gave light honest and due. He touched the rim of the tithe chest with his palm, and everyone watched his hand, the way he meant them to. Then he told them to accept the mark, as one accepts the seasons: crooked autumn for harvest, hard winter for fate, spring for God. Let not envy or avarice make you want more light than your station, he said. Lux humilis, humble light. Half the parish nodded like obedient rushes in a wind. The other half kept their heads still and let their thoughts amble in dark lanes. Mara's thoughts went to her son, 12 and quick, who had lately taken an interest in the watch. He admired the way their chain made a noise like a promise. He had started to rehearse different ways to call stamps visible in the doorway, and fancied himself a servant of safety. He was a child. He would drink any word sweetened with duty. Would you have paid? The thought came like a voice you hear when you are alone. Would you have held out your longed-for light and said, "Take a bite, I will chew the dark"? By Martinmas, the scent of tallow had become the town's fog. Candles wore their red bead like a boil you had chosen. The guildmen had settled into quarters at the inn, and took their dinners in a booth with a chain draped above it like a brazen garland. The bailiff's man gave to the poor the spectacle of justice when he had not the coin. He took a thatcher's wife, old, inclined to piety, and put her for an hour in the cucking stool, not for adultery but for selling 3 rushes without mark. The crowd did not jeer. They watched in a kind of soft silence, as if a new species of shame had been invented, and they were embarrassed to use it. She emerged dripping in gray and duly fined. There began a new custom, and like all customs it pretended to be ancient. When a child was betrothed, all his candles for the year to come were to be bought at the tax table on St. Lucy's Day, and the watch would count them out. 1 for each Sunday, 1 for each holy day, 2 for the nativity, and none for night study, unless the child burned for God. We shall not have girls teaching themselves letters by stolen light, the guildman said with that small smile that never reached his eyes. Mothers who had taught syllables by hearth coal, tracing letters on the sooty stone, turned away their faces. Mara's prophets shrank like a shadow pulled under a door. She could still sweeten her work, stir in a pinch of beeswax into a dip for a widow who had lost a husband to the sea, measure a wick a finger's breadth longer for a mother nursing through the night. But each kindness was a little theft, and each theft was a little risk. The inspector's feet passed her threshold often enough that she kept a pot of boiled nettle always at the ready, the steam like a veil to disguise whatever scent of unmarked fat might rise from a careless rag. On a snowless night of bitter wind, the watch found a stack of candles under the step of the weaver's shed, unmarked, smooth, honest to the touch, and equal to the stamped ones in all but that little bead of power. The weaver swore by the wounds that they were his dead wife's and had lain there for years, forgotten. The chain went up all the same. They took him to the market cross and set him in the stocks with the string of scorched rushes. His feet went white in the cold. The children had thin jackets and did not sing much. One of the watchmen rubbed his jaw with a gloved thumb like a man considering a cut of meat and said, "The piece has its price." Mara made a candle that night from the last wax left from a spring marriage, white, clean, with a lean scent like honey. She lit it in honor of no one earthly, then pinched it out and wrapped it in a cloth. There should be one light, she thought, in a town without law on it. But her son woke in the dark to the little after scent and said, "Mother, you mustn't. It will be smelled." He spoke like a watchman, and the little flame she had nursed went cold in her belly. A fortnight after, the guildmen announced a new refinement. No candle to be burned above the height of a man's belt except in church. The reason given was sound on its face. Smoke gathers under rafters, thatch is hungry for sparks. "Keep your light humble," said the priest again from the pulpit, working his Latin like a key. Humulus lux. The market scribes offered it as law, and the bailiff's man promised to enforce it with a light hand and a heavy purse. In the dye shop, where linen hung like flenstin, the women rolled their eyes and cut their threads closer to their hips. In the alehouses, the men leaned nearer their cups and told stories by the low light like conspirators, even when they were only speaking of fish. On the street, thieves smiled, for a town that keeps its lights low throws long, kind shadows. And in those shadows other things stirred. Hands that warmed a rushlight and then hid it, mouths that learned to whisper without spit, fingers that drew a symbol in grease on the underside of things, the bucket upside down on the crown. The day they chose the first example was a dry one. The winter had taken all wetness into itself, and the river ran like a steel ribbon. A man named Cole, the cooper, had rented his shed to a stranger who boiled fat at night. Perhaps he had taken coin for silence, perhaps he had not thought. The inspectors came in the hour after curfew with their billhooks and their chain and the iron die that now lived in every mind. They found the tub still warm. They dipped a stick in and held it up to the air. Fat clung and set like truth on a tongue. They sniffed, they turned up the straw, they found unstamped dips hung under the rafters, the forbidden height. And because the tale must be told to have force, they took Call and set him at the cross. They looped the chain, not tight enough to hurt, tight enough to mark. The clerk read the proclamation in Latin, then in English scraped thin for the poor, and the red bead bled its way down the post once more. Mara watched from the edge where the meat dog skulked. She thought of her jar under the ash, of her son's hungry righteousness, of the church's white candles that burned without penny or fear. She thought of God's light and men's, of how one was given and the other sold. She found an image for it, a crown balanced on a bucket. The bucket was full of grease and the crown was clean. "Tell me," the thought came again, sharper now. "How much darkness would you trade for a quiet door? How much smoke would you swallow to keep your head above the water of fines?" Someone in the crowd spat. The spit froze and held a fleck of soot like a small black star. When they let Call down, he was not broken. He was smaller. He went home with a slip for a fine that he would fold and unfold until it became soft as cloth. The watchmen went to the inn and coiled their chain above the booth to eat stew by the red gloss candle that did not sputter. The priest went to check the oil in the sanctuary lamp and found it full and shining like mercy. The guildmen counted their half-pennies and did not hide their smiles. At dawn, Mara dipped, up and down, until light had a body again. Her breath made a small cloud. Her fingers were white where the lie had worked them, red in the cracks. She tied off a dozen, stamped 6, wrapped 2, and hid 4. The math of hunger is never clean. She hung the stamped ones in the doorway. She placed the wrapped ones in a basket to carry to a widow, and she slid the hidden ones under the ash, where they had lived like dormice since the Lord's bead had bled. By the time the bell tolled prime, the inspector's careful hands were tapping at her threshold. Stamps visible, they said without looking. Her son stood among them, a borrowed chain over his shoulder like a sash. His eyes had a shine that was not unkindness. It was the light that comes from holding a rule. He would learn its heat in time, if time offered him such charity. She lifted the stamped candles. The red beads winked, neat as cherries on an iron plate. The guild chandler smiled. He reached for the die, and with the gentleness of a man blessing a child, he pressed it again into grease. Tap, yes. Crown. Bucket. Bell dot. Law dear eyed. Zu disallied. Side the fear mouth. At the gods at night. Accords us, the town breathed tallow. A crow on the church roof shook out its feathers and dropped a single black feather that whirled and lay on the ice like a sentence not yet spoken. The watch walked on. The bells counted the hours. The iron chain in the inn made its small music. And the light, such as it was, stayed low. By noon the frost was gone from the eaves and the town's thaw smelled of old smoke and kitchen damp. The inspectors left Mara's threshold trailing a ribbon of authority that seemed to hang in the air like steam, and behind them her boy walked lighter than his boots could earn, the borrowed chain whispering over his shoulder as if telling him secrets. He would return it at dusk, the bailiff's man had said, but a borrowed chain can teach a permanent lesson. On that day Greyford wore 2 new notices. One was on the market cross, red wax cooling in a dark tier. Renewal of mirage, a levy for the maintenance of the Lord's walls and the safety of the common. The other was by St. Bride's Well, the script narrower, clerk's hand cramped and fussy, cesspits to be walled within 40 days, drains to be covered, no rubbish to be cast into ditches upon pain of fine and inspection. Beneath, in smaller letters, the name of the farmer who had purchased the right to collect the fines. Master Duel of the port city, the same careful-handed guildman who stamped candles. He had branched his authority like a tree, light and filth, both not to move without his touch. The night soil carriers grew busy, shuffling their buckets like monks shuffle beads, knocking at doors with a timid confidence, hungry for coin and terrified of its scent. They wore a thin iron badge stamped, of course, with the crown and the bucket, and now a third sign, a grate. If you had eyes to read them, their badges were little maps of how the town meant to live. Waste must go where the mark pointed. Light must burn where the mark allowed. Mara's yard had a pit lined with rotten planks, dug by her husband in the summer when his cough had been soft enough to ignore. The board squelched underfoot. Rats had given it passages and secret dry places, and she covered it with hurdles when it rained. Now the inspector lifted the hurdle, peered in, and recited a list of small shames. The walling is insufficient. The plank lies too low. The water table rises when the tide is fat. Neighbors may complain of smell. This last was said not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. Smell can be commanded to serve. 40 days, the inspector said, and his breath ghosted and disappeared. Stone to the height of a man's knee. A cover of fitted plank. A fee to the Lord for the inspection. Another to Master Duel for the advice. Advice, Mara said. The word had more grease on it than a sausage. He repeated and wrote it down. She almost laughed and did not. The math of hunger is never clean. The math of law is always clean, even when its figures are drawn with a dirty finger. She thought of the stones she would need, the man she would have to hire, the work that would keep her away from her pot. She saw in her mind how her small hoard of pennies, kept in a cloth purse under a loose brick, would turn to ordered stacks that would turn to nothing. She would owe bread to the baker and cheeks to the wind. That week, the assize weighed bread like a miser weighs silver. The alderman took to shaking loaves and holding them to his ear as if they might confess. 2 bakers were caught with light bread and made to stand with loaves hung around their necks, shame pendulums knocking soft against their ribs. Bakers cheat with air. A child hummed, skipped, and nearly fell into a slop puddle. The pillory was in use so often that the wood took on the faint warmth of bodies, and the iron bit smelled sweet as old blood and damp as wool. Would you have paid full weight for half a loaf, the thought asked, sly as a beggar? Or would you call it even when the tax took the rest? A wedding gave the town a brief chance to breathe like a man breaking the surface of cold water, and the hand of authority pushed the head down again. It was in a tavern yard, a bright poor feast with a pie made of fish and spinach, and 2 thin ribbons of dyed wool for the bride and groom. The wool was not costly, the colors were not forbidden, but joy makes its own crimes. Sumptuary agents under Master Dull's protection, he had many protections, came with their shears and their tally. They cut the ribbons, citing a clause about colors unseemly for the estate of fisherfolk. They fined the groom for a fringe on his cap, and the fiddler for wearing a second-hand velvet strip on his sleeve, a keepsake from a dead uncle that had been cut down so often it could not make envy stir in a stone. When the shears snipped, the yard made the soft sound people make when something private is exposed in public. The bride's mother tied a rush cord around her daughter's wrist, kissed her forehead. The girl imagined it a blessing, and did not see the cord as another chain. The Lord's man raised the scroll with its crimson seal, and read what the king's peace required: drabness for the poor, glory for the altar and for the Lord, a chart of your color against your hunger. The bathhouse, which the town called the stew, put up a new board of rules, timings for men and timings for women. Old bread at the door to pay in kind if you had no penny, a prohibition against singing, because the notice said too many voices drew the fire into sin, and above all, no candle. The keeper swept the floor with a willow broom and shook his head. They will measure the heat next, he muttered, not loudly. The stones sweated. The air tasted of lime and bodies. A woman washed a baby and held his mouth open to chase a flea under his lip with the fine end of a comb. The baby laughed. Laughter still existed. It came like a small bird and fled before hands could close. Levy collectors made the rounds under the mirage. They counted roof beams and chickens alike, weighing a burden the way some men weigh a glance. The tallage for the town was set on a board by the cross. Beside it, the names of households, and in a thin, cruel column, the word arrears. Behind that word there was a stair that led to a locked door. The dungeon under the castle's outer hall, low-roofed and red with rust. The castellan, a narrow man with a fine quill and a habit of warming his hands over a candle like a miser over his chest, had lately taken to charging a fee for entry and a fee for keeping and a fee for hearing a confession of debt. He wrote each fee in a ledger, letters as neat as his soul. They said he slept well. What he dreamed could not be taxed. Cole the cooper, who had been the example at the cross, missed his fee. The chain over his wrists had left a memory, and memories do not buy bread. The watch came 2 evenings after his arrears mark was refreshed on the board. They did not drag him. They led him gently, with a hand at the elbow. They called him neighbor. In the outer hall the castellan read a brief list: failure to pay, suspicion of light burned high, a whispered rumor that his dead wife had kept unstamped dips. The castellan did not say the rumor had been whispered by a child who wanted to please men with chains. He tilted his head and listened to Cole, who spoke in a soft barley voice, more chaff than grain in it. The castellan nodded as if understanding were a kind of mercy, then wrote in his book, "One night to consider, fee for the use of the straw, fee for the door, fee for the keys where." He said the words like a litany. In the cell, Cole found a chalk mark on the wall. Short strokes stood in 5s, then 10s, then a long line that faded where a thumb had rubbed. He touched it, then touched his throat where the chain had rested, and thought of hoops that hold. He slept no worse than the castellan. The town, which could endure much, edged that week toward a kind of heat that the winter air could not blunt. A baker was found to have cut bread with dried bean meal and not declared it. A tax gatherer struck a man, lightly, but with the heel of his hand, when the man laid 2 clipped pennies down and swore by the saints they were all he had. A rush collector from the marsh hamlet was refused a license, and his wife's pot was seized. She watched it go in the cart with the belt of her wedding gown inside it, a belt that had kept it warm in winter when something warm felt like love. These are small things, you will say. Small things wear teeth sharp by repetition. On the 5th Sunday after the cespit decree, the bailiff's man led a relic parade. The parish owned a rib of St. Mildred. No one knew from which body it had actually come, only that it came out once a year on a day of trouble, and the trouble would go shy for a breath. The rib was sewn into a packet of linen and sealed with 2 blobs of wax. The priest held it high with both hands and walked under a canopy on poles borrowed from the market awning. The bell rang, deep and steady, as if the iron itself believed. People came to their doors, and men doffed caps, and women lowered eyes, and the watch paced beside the priest like dogs beside a shepherd. The relic went past the ass's water butt, past the tanner's yard with its hanging skins, gray as the thoughts in a man's head, and paused by the cross where the board in its arrears column shone in a cold, honest light. The priest touched the parcel to the wood. The crowd exhaled a sound that could be prayer or hunger. Take your pick. "Saint Mildred of us all," he said in Latin, then in English. "Keep our houses safe, our candles humble, our rage contained." He smiled sorrowfully, as if to say the burden was his as well. Men love a shepherd who appears to carry a lamb. That night there were no riots. There were mutters. There was a minor, polite vandalism. Someone flipped the bucket emblem upside down on 3 notices with a greasy thumbprint. Someone put a red bead of sealing wax on a dung heap and laughed quietly into their sleeve. And someone, perhaps 2, walked the lane behind the brewhouse and said aloud softly like a charm, "If we must keep our candles low, we will keep our heads lower and our wrath higher, to be spent when a door is open." These words did not move the air. They moved the blood. The next morning a boy, Mara's boy, knocked on doors to demand sight of stamps. He was earnest to the point of pain, and believed himself a hinge between danger and safety. He bent to look at rush baskets, and glanced under benches, a smile ready to accept confessions like pennies. At a weaver's house, he found nothing. At a fishwife's, he found 2 old stumps of beeswax in a jar and left them, because he had not yet learned that power loves old things most of all. At a dyer's he found a single dip hung at shoulder height, high, and his hand went to the chain on his shoulder, his mouth to the words he had been taught. "Say them," the watchman said behind him, half kindly, half hungry. "By order of his lordship," the boy said, "and for the safety of the town, light must be humble. Bring it down or bring a fine." His voice shook and steadied. He had said the thing, therefore he was part of the thing. The dyer's wife blew out the candle and set it by the floor, and looked at the boy's eyes for a long moment. They were his father's eyes, and they held obedience like a pebble holds a flash of the sun. She nodded. He nodded. The watch wrote a mark on the tally and moved on. A law had not been broken because the word had come in time. This is how order feeds itself on small, edible moments. A week later, The cesspit men returned to Mara's yard. Stone was half laid. A mason named Will had been hired with 3 loaves and a promise. He stood in his gray cloak with a trowel like a priest holds a cross. "I will return tomorrow," he had said every day for 5 days, and on the 6th, as he set a flat wet stone, he said, "Tomorrow again." Tomorrow is the coin the poor use when they cannot find any other. The inspector measured the wall with a stick that had notches cut at lawful heights, and frowned, as if the stone had offended him by being itself. "Short," he said. "It grows," Mara said. "As God's grace does." "God's grace is not in my memorandum," he answered, not unkind. He had learned to mix pity with duty. It made the draft go down smoother for both. He wrote a fine for delay, and a smaller one for a hinge that squeaked on the privy door. A hinge Master Dool's men had decided might cause distress to the neighbor. Mara signed with a cross, because even crosses can be made to serve. The mason laughed quietly when the inspector left, then coughed, then spat a small stone of phlegm onto the ground, and looked embarrassed, as if he had been caught stealing faith. "There are rumors," he said in a low voice, eyes on the mud he had made, "of fevers in the south. Men tie herbs to their doors and pay to forbid the road. The Lord will levy a passage tax for carts bearing strangers. They will say it is to separate the healthy from the sick, and it will be, and it will also separate the poor from their bread." Mara thought of edicts she had not yet smelled but could imagine. Watchmen counting bodies as they counted candles, markets closed with wax and chanted words, prices fixed because fear makes men cruel in markets. She thought of the bell, patient and tireless, that would be rung for safety until even God would put his fingers in his ears. She said nothing. Silence can be a prayer or a weapon. That afternoon, the market swelled like a bruise. A farmer from the upcountry charged 2 farthings more for his onions, citing the mirage. A woman with 3 children demanded he lower the price, citing her children's bellies. The alderman stepped in and declared the price fixed at yesterday's rate, citing the assize. The farmer swore by saints unregulated, and said the road had eaten his donkey. Words rose, hands rose, and for a moment, just the length of a breath held too long, the square held the shape of riot. Then the watch chain sang its small song, and the sound of iron over stone made the shape fall apart like a loaf shaken too hard. "Would you have thrown your onion?" The thought whispered, amused and sad. "Would you have paid a fine to call it a stone?" By evening, the Castellan had embraced a new fashion, show trials. He called them hearings, but he held them at the 6th hour when men are tired and candles look too much like coins. And he made the accused stand on her window so that the light from it made their faces look already judged. He chose cases that could be told easily. A woman who sold 3 rushes without mark, a lad who lit a candle near thatch, a tanner's boy who dumped a bucket of urine too near the well, a cooper who missed his fee. He read the law not as mercy but as grain read by a miller, a measure to turn into profit. He let the crowd murmur. He let them feel they had been part of the weighing. He wrote the fee in his ledger and touched the page as some men touch relics. He dismissed each case with a phrase from the proclamation, "For the safety of the town." He tasted each word like marrow. Mara stood at the back of the hall one night and listened. The air was a stew of tallow, wool, wet shoes, and the priest's simple incense. Her boy stood straight near the door, hands at his sides, face serious as iron. Once, he scratched his wrist where the chain had rubbed him raw, and she felt pity and a flicker of anger, at whom she could not say. The Castellan read, chalk scraped, the clerk dipped his quill. Above the judge's shoulder a wall showed a graffito half scrubbed, a crown with a bucket perched on it, upside down. A hand had tried to clean it, and had only made the soot smear like a bruise under the skin. After the hearing, The priest took the relic rib once more from its cupboard, sans canopy, and walked it around the hall like a cat walks a fence, delicately, with a small tremor of pride. He let the bone-swaddled cloth touch the castellan's ledger. The castellan did not object. He smiled, small and careful. The town watched the exchange, a rib for a book, a story for a law, and did not know which to find more holy. On a morning that smelled of thawed dung and the river's breath, Mara finished the stone around her pit. The mason set the last stone and pressed his palm against it as if swearing to a marriage. He crossed himself with the sharpness of a man who likes the shape of a cross, even when he is unsure of the grace behind it. "It will hold," he said, "until the river decides otherwise. Rivers collect taxes no man has recorded." Master Duel came himself to inspect, the die in his pouch making a small sum of iron. He walked with a footing that took the world's board for granted. He tapped the stone, he sniffed, he read the hinge with his ear, he approved with a fee for the approval. Then he turned, and his eyes slid lightly over the yard's corners and rested briefly on the ash by the hearth. The ash lay smooth. The ash lay innocent. The ash whispered, "Because ash remembers." He smiled. "The town speaks well of your obedience," he said. "And your boy speaks well of your prudence." "My boy speaks as he is taught," Mara said. "As all boys do," he answered, and his careful hands made an amphora out of the air, then set it down. "A word of further safety. There will be a night inspection of lights on St. Lucy's Eve. All candles to be counted, tallied, and blessed. We shall take pledges for the year's needs so that no household need panic at the price of light. Think of it as peace purchased early. Peace purchased early." Mara felt something like cold fire under the skin of her neck. A year's light bought at once, money locked into a wax that would wait, and those who could not pay would be given a pledge to sign, and the castellan's ledger would fatten, and Master Duel's careful hands would bless. She nodded as if she had understood something gentle. When he was gone, she sat on the low step and looked at her hands, red in the cracks, gray in the lines where the ash had made home, white where the lie had chewed. Her nails were blunt from work. She pressed her thumb into her palm and made a crescent. She held it until the skin remembered. Then she stood and began to dip. Up and down, up and down. The rhythm was a prayer she had made herself, and no priest could bless better. St. Lucy's Eve came with a wind like a thin whip. The watch went door to door, the chain polite, the billhooks resting like sleeping dogs. The priest blessed bundles of rush and tall stacks of stamped dips with a murmur that felt like rain on the scalp. The alderman counted and wrote. The bailiff's man collected pledges and made marks beside names that would next be written in the castellan's book. In the inn, Master Duel ate broth and warmed his fingers, and the chain above his booth gleamed red with candle. He had invented a phrase to describe the night for the Lord, binding the town to its light. He liked the shape of it. He would say it again. At Maras, the count went smooth. Stamped candles laid on the table like small white bones, rush bundles ranked like a sheaf army, a jar of oil sealed and approved. The priest blessed, the clerk smiled, the watchman, her boy, looked at her with an odd, hopeful pride. He believed he had given her something, not mercy exactly, but order, and he had begun to love order in the way a cold man loves any flame. When they had gone, she reached into the ash and withdrew, quick and sure, a cloth-wrapped cylinder, the clean beeswax candle she had made and hidden, the one with the scent like honey and memory. She set it in a dish and did not light it. She held it like a relic. It could be lit for a birth, for a death, for a moment when a voice must be made large enough to reach heaven. It could be lit for nothing at all, and still be holy. She put it back. Ash closed its mouth over it. The winter turned its face. Fevers came up from the coast with men who had walked too far and eaten too little. The town posted a rope across the south gate and charged a penny to lift it for strangers in the name of health. A notice went up: no new households without permission, no bed let to the unknown, no burial without witness. A woman coughed in the market, and 6 people stepped back as one. The priest asked for alms for oil. The alderman fixed the price of garlic. The bathhouse barred songs entirely. The bell learned a new rhythm and rang in a way that made the hairs at the nape rise up one by one like wheat in a gust. Master Dool spoke of preventive mercy. The castellan wrote a fee for the rope. The watch learned a new call: who goes? What mark? What health? The answers were always imperfect. Health is a candle you cannot stamp. Men put herbs over their doors, and women rubbed vinegar on their palms, and everyone paid something to feel that the air could be counted. The night soil carriers knocked softly and left their buckets heavy. And in that fearful air, the town did not riot. It made a quieter choice. It learned to bow to notices before they went up. It rehearsed obedience in its throat. It taught its children to say the proclamations with their prayers. It learned that if you keep the light low and the smell contained and the chain singing, you can hush even the thought that would have thrown a stone. Not every heart obeyed. A mark appeared one morning on the back of the market cross, drawn with a child's clumsy finger in soot and fat, a crown, and on it a bucket turned upside down, and under it a bell without a clapper. It was ugly. It was brave. The watch washed it away, and the stain darkened the wood in a way that made the image live longer in the eye than the thing itself had on the board. Mara saw the stain one market day and found herself smiling, then pressing her lips together as if to keep the smile from escaping and being fined. Her boy saw her see it. He did not smile. He had learned the shape of duty so well that he could not see his mother's mouth without seeing the law's teeth. He looked at her, and then at the chain, and his fingers touched the place on his wrist where it had rubbed him into a man. "Tell me," the thought asked one last time that day, not unkindly. "What price would you pay for a door that never knows the fist? What light would you snuff to keep your name from the ledger? Would you bless the stamp and curse the bees?" The bell rang. The wind scraped the lane. The priest lifted the rib. The castellan lifted his quill. Master Dool lifted his careful hands and made a shape of the town between them as if he could carry it in a jar. And Greyford, in the year of our Lord 1321, learned to keep its light low and its breath shallow, and to walk as if a chain hung above every door and might fall if any word spoke too loud. The thaw did not last. It broke, and a pinch of iron returned to the air as if the year had clenched its jaw. In that clenched weather, the town's story tightened too. Strangers' fevers moved house to house like a thin gray cat that could slip through any door. The rope at the gate lifted and dropped for coins. The bathhouse steamed in silence. The market cried softly and often. The bell learned the names of the sick and the names of the dead, and though the priest said the names were written where moth and rust could not come, moth and rust had friends enough in Greyford. Cole the cooper failed to return from the castellan's one-night hearing. The fee to keep him grew heavier than his offense. On the 3rd day his sister brought a loaf as surety, and on the 5th she brought a stool because his legs had forgotten standing, and on the 6th she brought only her silence. The ledger took each offering without a tremor. When at last the key turned, Cole came out thinner than a stave, smelling of straw and iron, mouth set like someone who had learned the taste of a locked room. He went home past the cross and did not look up. Mara watched him go and felt the tug of her own hidden light. She kept the beeswax candle under ash as she kept a thought under her tongue, saved for the hour when speech must be more than air. She worked, she dipped, She wrapped a pair of good dips for a neighbor who sat with her husband through a fever. She hid 4 poor rushlights for a mother with 3 children and no coin for stamps. Each kindness had the click of a small clasp behind it, binding her to a risk. On St. Agatha's morning the castellan called another hearing, and the crowd came with their hunger folded small as a handkerchief. The cases marched: a lad for tipping dung too near the well, a baker whose loaves were light because his flour had been, a woman who stitched a thin ribbon on her bodice for courage. Master Dool stood in a corner like a coat peg, his careful hands quiet, the iron die asleep in its pouch. The priest stood near the tithe chest and blew out a candle that flickered near the ledger, and though the crowd laughed, they laughed with their mouths shut. When the hall emptied, Mara's boy lingered. His chain was no longer borrowed. It had become his in the manner of habits, by wearing. The place where it lay on his shoulder had caloosed smooth. The bailiff's man clapped him, lightly, behind the ear and called him keen. The boy kept his eyes on the door as if doors were exams, and he meant to pass them. He did not see Mara at the back. She stepped out only when he had gone, let her gaze rest on the smear where the upside-down bucket had been scrubbed again, and pressed her palm to the cool wall. The soot left her skin unmarked, but she felt as if it had written something there. That night, the thatch over Tom the Thatcher's own lean-to took a coal. Not a foxfire flicker this time, a line of red like a seam being sewn, then unsewn by shouted water. Neighbors dumped buckets. One hand rang the bell so hard it boomed out of shape and sulked into a duller tone. When the hiss and steam settled, the watch found the culprit, a dip set on a shelf higher than a man's belt, a sin of convenience and of cold fingers. The law required a show. Tom's arms were roped with rush, and his head was bowed at the cross before his hair had dried. Mara stood 3 bodies back. The wind brought her the smell of singed straw and wet dog and iron. The clerk read, for safety. Master Dool nodded as if told a fair tale. The priest laid a hand on Tom's shoulder and murmured that all light must be humble. The crowd accepted the sentence the way men accept weather. But after, in the shifting aside, Mara heard a slip of dissent, not shouted, not even spoken, a breath given shape. He set it high to see his work and bring it down again. We set shame high, and we leave it there. By the week's end, the fevers took the thatcher's wife. The priest walked slow at her bier, with the parish's small rib held under linen. He set it on her breast for a breath, and lifted it away. The children followed with the steady faces of the newly reft. Tom walked with his cap in his hands, and his mouth at the wrong shape for prayer. After the earth took her, he came to Mara's, eyes hollow as an old stove. A light, he said, as if ordering a loaf. For the night. For the room. Stamped? Mara asked. Because some habits save you. He looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign town. A light, he said again. She sold him 2 stamped taps and set 3 coarse rushlights in his basket where they might hide under his rag cloak, gifts without name. Then, after he left, she waited with the ash cooling before her, and when the house had exhaled and the lane was quiet, she took out the beeswax candle. Its skin was clean as a saint's story. She smelled its faint honey, and the clover she had mixed to disguise even that. She lit it. Light stood up, white and steady in a way tallow never could manage. It filled the small room with a gentleness that had nothing to do with law. The beam on the rafters was a stripe of mercy. The air held its breath. She set it on the table beside her husband's old knife, and the lice comb and a folded scrap of prayer that had been tucked into the tithe chest and returned to her by a clerk by mistake. The flame did not chatter. It proclaimed nothing. It simply gave. Footsteps came while it burned. The chain whispered first. Then her boy's voice, soft and dutiful at the door. Mother? Inspection. She did not move. Sometimes a thing must be allowed to finish telling you what it is. He opened the door in the outside night, folded back like a blanket. He saw the candle at once. He saw its height, which was the height of her pride, higher than a man's belt. He saw, too, that it had no bead and would take no dye. Behind him, the watchman made the small intake men make when work becomes easy. Her boy did not speak. He took one step in. Cold rode in with him. His hand went to the chain, not to lift it, only to feel where it had made a man's place on his shoulder. His mouth shaped the law's words. Then, only then, he looked at her. In his face, she saw every lesson she had given him in the cradle about truth, and every lesson the town had given him since about order. He lifted his hand up to the beam where the flame drew its white stripe, and down to his belt where the rule lived, and back again as if weighing. "Lower it," he said, and his voice held both a child and a watchman. "For safety." She stood, took the dish, and set it low. The flame altered the room's look as if a fine had been paid. He nodded once. His eyes were wet with something that was not only smoke. The watchman behind him shifted his feet, disappointed in the lack of theater, and made a mark on the tally. "Stamped?" he asked. "By rote." "Blessed," Mara said, because she could not help herself. Her boy did not smile. He turned to go and paused in the doorway. "Mother," he said, quiet. "If I come again, let it be out." Then he stepped away, and the chain's small music went with him. She pinched the wick. A twist of smoke curled like a thin Latin letter and wrote itself on the roof beam. In the dark that followed, she sat very still and felt floor cold in her feet and a heat in her chest that did not need fire to live. She wrapped the candle in cloth and gave it back to the ash. The ash took it like a secret. The fevers ebbed and left a rawness. The mirage renewed. The cesspits passed inspection and bloomed in summer like a memory that no washing can sweeten. Master Duel left for the port with his careful hands and his pouch of iron and wax. Another man with a similar smile arrived. The castellan's ledger thickened by a finger's breadth. The rib of St. Mildred did its yearly round. The bathhouse allowed humming again, but fineable if merry. The thatcher raised his shed. A new mark appeared one dawn on the cross. A bucket inverted over a crown drawn smaller, neater, almost elegant, as if the town had learned to do its disobedience with a steadier hand. Mara's boy grew into his chain, then grew beyond it. He learned to look aside when he could, and look directly when he must. Once in a spring rain, he stood before a woman who had hung her one dip at shoulder height to mend torn cuffs, and said, "Bring it low when you are done," and did not write a fine. Later, he wrote 3, and one sent a man to the stocks for pride, more than for smoke. He prayed with a mouth that knew how to keep secrets short. In time, the watch learned his caution and called it soft. He called it exact. Mara kept dipping. Old hands will always find their rhythm. Her yardstone held. Rats found other paths. She sold stamped light to those who could bear its bead and unmarked mercy to those who could not. Sometimes she would feel under the ash for the beeswax and simply hold it unlit. Hope, too, can be a candle that stays whole. Years peeled. The crown changed heads. The bucket did not. The bell kept its duller tone from that one fire night, as if it had been taught a permanent grief. The laws were renewed, amended, folded with new words, and smoothed with old. The town remembered Greyford 1321, not as a date but as a smell. Tallow wet stone, rushes drying, a chain that sang a narrow tune. Men told the tale of the candle that burned too high and brought a shame. Women told the tale of the beeswax lit once and put away before the law could taste it. Children drew crowns and buckets in mud and laughed until someone shushed them. What did it cost to keep the peace? A ledger knows, but it will not tell you in words you can sleep on. A town knows, but it will tell you only if you stand still long enough to smell it. If you were there, if you had to weigh your hunger against the mark, your nights against the bead, your neighbor's pity against your child's duty, what light would you have allowed yourself? Would you have paid the tithe to the last sheaf of your courage, or would you have hidden a small candle under ash and counted that your prayer? If this tale troubled your sleep, tell me below, what price would you have paid for a day without the chain? And if you would hear more, listen next to the market that fined the poor for washing, or the village that paid taxes for a king they never saw.